Hello, everyone. Pastor George here with today's Bible study recap. And today in Bible study, we looked at John chapter 9, which is actually my favorite chapter in the Bible for a lot of reasons. But we looked at this one particularly in light of what we talked about last Sunday, which was healing. And this is a story of healing that Jesus does, but it has a few quirks in there that I think are really important to think about, because oftentimes when we think of miraculous healing or healing that's done by Jesus, we think of people being cured of whatever disease they have, and that being a good thing, right? And also, it usually in the Gospels is not too concerned about why this is going on, whether or not why they're suffering or why Jesus cures this person. Usually something happens and Jesus heals someone, right? But John chapter 9 gives us a really good look at the world that Jesus lived in, what people thought about suffering, how Jesus, and therefore God, views suffering, and also the outcome of someone being healed from a very difficult situation, and then entering into another difficult situation. So John chapter 9 is the story of the healing of the man who was born blind, or the man who was blind from birth. And in this story, Jesus and his disciples are walking along in Jerusalem, and they see a man who was born blind. Now, this man is begging, and the disciples ask a question. They ask a theological question. We could say that this is a question that all of us ask today too, which is, why is this guy born blind? Like, why do people suffer? That's a question that I think all of us should ask, and maybe have asked, and maybe have fielded that question, if you're answering that. And Jesus says, well, to them, he first responds to what they believe. And their belief is that this guy is born blind because someone sinned, either his parents or himself, right? That was the common belief at the time, is that if someone has some sort of condition, it's either their sin somehow or their parents' sin that caused this to happen to them. That's what the disciples think. Now, Jesus, he says it wasn't sin that did this. It was so that God's glory might be shown. And then he says, I am the light of the world, and we still need to do the works of while I'm in the world, right? Okay, so then he heals the man, he puts mud on his eyes, tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. It's one of these pools in Jerusalem. The man does it. Then, from that point, he can see, right? But here's the thing, is he doesn't know who healed him. He's blind, right? But he's walking around. People are seeing him. They go, oh, we know you. You were born blind from birth. Why are you able to do this? He says, I was healed, right? And so what do? They take the religious leaders, and they bring them to the man, or the man to them. And they question him. They want to interrogate how this happened, because either something really bad is going on or something miraculous happened. And they're questioning him, and they go, who did this to you? And then he says, I don't know who it was, but, he made mud and put it on my eyes, and now I can see, right? And then you have the parents questioned. So they bring the man's parents to corroborate the fact that he's always been blind, and they put it completely on their son, because they don't want to deal with this situation and tend to get in trouble, because they realize that what's going on here is kind of like a trial. And so they go, you ask him, right, what's going on. And so they again go and ask him, and they say, all right, this guy's a sinner. They assume that because Jesus did work on the Sabbath, right? It's a Sabbath day. John makes the point of telling us that. So that means, like, the making of the mud, for instance, would have been considered work by the Pharisees, who believed that that was the interpretation of the law to not work on the Sabbath. And so they say he's a sinner, and he says, listen, I'm not going to say this, but you guys can't tell what's going on, and they don't like that, and they kick him out, of the synagogue, right? That's what it says. And it's after he's been kicked out that he runs into Jesus again, and Jesus then has a dialogue with him, where the man confesses that he believes in him and he worships him, and then Jesus, uses this as a teaching moment for it. And then, of course, Jesus has an interaction with the Pharisees where he tells them that they're blind, right, and that they're the ones who are actually sinful, and that's how John chapter 9 ends. Now, I find this interesting for the reasons I put at the beginning, which is um, the theology of it, right? Especially the suffering. So the man is healed from being born blind at birth, and we don't know how long that was. The other time John uses this construction, it's about a man who cannot walk, um, and it says that it was, I want to say, 31 years, 35 years, maybe. Long time, right? Point is it's a long time. It's a long time to live with this condition. Um, it's not as though you're blind for a week or a day or whatever, but this is like a long time, decades spent without being able to see. And the first thing he says about this, Jesus says, is this is done so that it might glorify God. And how often in our own suffering do we think that this is going to glorify God? I mean, I think that's a really important thing to think about when it comes to healing and disease and sickness, right? Is we often can't see how it can glorify God in any way, but that's what the Bible says, right? Jesus says that this guy got this so that this can glorify God. And so we have to have that mentality when we are sick or see sickness in the world and think about, okay, how can this glorify the Lord? Second thing is that he is healed from his blindness, but he still faces great difficulty, right? So the guy is healed, which is awesome, right? That's probably what he's wanted his whole life. Has that only led to good things for him? No, it actually has gotten him kicked out of his community, right? He's exited from the synagogue, which is exiling from a community life, his community. And so I think oftentimes we think his healing is only having good and positive reactions. Now, in the ultimate end, this healing does, right? He believes in Jesus, and that's what actually matters, right? That's what's important. But the thing to note is that this is not a all good thing, right? Oftentimes we can maybe view healing that way. Oh, if it's healed, everything's going to work out, everything's going to be great. It's like maybe not, right? I always find that important. And lastly, right, this shows us about who Jesus is. It shows us that he has the power over these things, and that he is intimately connected with what's going on here. And ultimately, the healing, yes, is of the physical, but it's actually the spirit, because there's this battle in the language that Jesus uses between the light and the darkness, right? Between truth and falsehood, between good and evil. And Jesus here is the representation of the light, right? So it's not only the fact that the man can see physically now, but it's also this idea that he is actually able to, it says he's seeing light. And one of the things at the end here is there's allusions, I would say, to Isaiah. And in the prophet Isaiah, he's tasked by God to go to the people and not make them unblind. He's supposed to help them to be blind because it's bringing about judgment upon them. And this is kind of the idea that Jesus gets into with the Pharisees at the end, right? Now, that also it is in Isaiah that the Messiah is a healer who will restore sight to the blind. So that's an important thing to remember. But here, right, it's like this is leading up to glorification of God in a lot of ways, right? The man is healed. He glorifies God through his healing and glorifies God through his suffering as he turns to Jesus, even though he's been exiled out of his community. And the Pharisees are glorifying God in their own odd way, not because of doing what's right, but because doing what's evil, right? They're bringing judgment upon themselves, and therefore God is just in the judgment that he's going to render on them. And so you see there's a lot of things going on here, and that's why I love John 9 so much, is that it just seems like a healing story at the start, but there's these layers of theology that are in there and that are really challenging to us, especially if we cling so stubbornly to our own will and desires instead of giving them up to God. So just something to remember. I think that that's really important. That's what we talked about today. Hopefully something interesting for you to think about. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Peace out.